today's session going. So, welcome to our ECF training session, which will be hosted today by Charlotte Warr from Sarnia Training, who's very well known in the market on ECF and claims processes. So, this forms part of our ongoing series of Claims Essentials IUA training sessions. There's plenty going on, so please make sure that you're on the IUA distribution list if you want to receive any details. You can contact myself or Deb for further details. I'm Priya. I'm a Senior Underwriting and Claims Executive at the IUA. In case you haven't come across us before, we're a trade association for the company market in London, representing over 80 insurers and reinsurers. We run committees across almost all classes of business, bringing together practitioners to discuss common issues and to promote good practice. Be sure to check the IUA's events page as we have a number of upcoming claims events. And just a few admin points to note. We'll set aside some time for questions at the end of the session, and hopefully you spotted the Q&A function within the platform. We will also be circulating the slides, and we are also recording this session. So I'll pass over to Charlotte to get this session started.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Priya, and a very good afternoon to those of you sitting around the table. And a big thank you actually to the IUA for organising these sessions, which I think are really, really important just to make sure that all of us in the market actually understand how we should be using these platforms in order basically to manage claims as efficiently as we can. So I've got simple objectives for today. I want everybody sitting around the table, and we're going to find out who you are in a minute, to confidently be able to use the functionality of the two different versions of company market ECF. And then I'm going to make sure that you also understand, where appropriate, the functionality differences with the Lloyd's version of ECF as well. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to the basics of actually talking about, explaining and showing in diagrammatic form what ECF actually is, then just thinking about whether it can be used for all types of claims, and then how to use it. And we will talk very briefly at the end of the session about SCAP, Single Claims Agreement Party, but if you want more information about SCAP, there is a dedicated SCAP session also run by the IUA in a few weeks' time. So check out the IUA events page to actually find out when and to register for it. So we are going to have 3 polling questions throughout the session. They're all anonymous, so don't worry. Nobody is going to be analysing your particular response, but they're really helpful to me and perhaps also to you as well, as you will see in a minute. So the first question, please, Justin, I want to know who I've got sitting around the table. So hopefully you know who you are. And so if you could kindly vote, that just gives me a picture of who's around the table, and it means that I set my comments out accordingly. Okay, I think let's have a look at the results, please, Justin, because everybody should know who they are. Okay, so that's good. We've got a nice combination of people sitting around the table. We have people who are part of the broker stakeholder fraternity, and that includes experts collecting their own fees. And then we also have insurers. So brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Justin. Let's move on. So, what is ECF? One of those fundamental questions in life. It's important to understand that it's not a single system. It's not a single sort of piece of technology. It is an ecosystem, and it's made up of a number of elements. Firstly, it's made up of something called the class database. Now, I've no idea whether I've got very, very long-standing market members sitting around the table, but some of you might be old enough to remember the original databases, which were CLAMS, and ELAS. And I'll explain how they came together to form class in a moment. So that is the hard database into which the brokers or the experts collecting their own fees enter data to present to insurers. The second piece of technology is the filing cabinet, the insurer's market repository. And that's the same filing cabinet that the placing colleagues for our broker friends should have put all the risk documents. But sitting alongside and a fundamental part of the ecosystem is actually what I might call the rules of the game. And there are two sets of rules. There are the system processes and procedures, and there's one set for the company market, one set for the Lloyd's market, and they tell you the business rules in terms of how to use the technology. And it's important to actually know what those are, because sometimes the business rules say that you shouldn't be doing something and the technology might let you do it. But then also what we have is the claims handling rules. So on the Lloyd's side, it's the Lloyd's claims lead arrangements. And on the company market side, it's the IUA claims handling guidelines. And it's important to understand that the London company market is not a single entity in terms of the claims handling rules. There are different parts of it that have different sets of rules around practical things like who can make decisions. So the IUA claims agreement guidelines, which set out basically who can make decisions, how objections work, that type of thing, they have been updated and a new version was published back end of last year. So next polling question, please, Justin. Be honest. I don't know who you are, but just be honest. Okay, Justin, let's see what the results are. Okay, well, alongside a copy of the slides that will come out to you after this event, I'm going to ask Priya to circulate either a copy of the guidelines themselves or a copy or a link to the page on the IUA website where they are, because I would really recommend that you cast your eye across them, whether you be a broker or a carrier, because it helps understand, as I've said, what the rules of the game are. So, moving on. Company market ECF. The company market have been using electronic claims for a very long time, far, far longer than the Lloyd's market. And the work to build electronic claims platforms started in the mid to late 80s. And because electronic claims have been used in the company market for so long, pretty much everything is in scope. And that is in stark contrast to the Lloyd's version of ECF, where there's quite a lot of stuff that is out of scope. So if you're a broker or a fee collector, you need to be mindful of that. And also, because a number of you are both company and Lloyd's players, you also have to be mindful of that. And the only thing that's really changed from the original company market claims handling platforms in the late 80s, which were the CLAMS database for the marine and aviation market and the ELAS database for the non-marine and reinsurance market, is that the databases have been brought a bit closer together. And so you now have that combined name class. But it's important to understand that the databases are not completely amalgamated. And I'll explain what I mean by that. What's happened is that the insurers market repository, the IMR, the filing cabinet, has been bolted on. And so it's not a case anymore where the broker would send out an electronic message to a company market carrier. And then if requested, trot around with the file, because now the file is in the IMR. But that history of the two separate wings of the company market, because the IUA as a combined trade body only came into existence in 1999, which I appreciate might be before some of you were born, but it's only yesterday as far as I'm concerned. The technology was not amalgamated. So that's why we have two completely different and distinct versions of ECF for the company market. And so as a broker or as an expert collecting their own fees, you need to be able to identify in your list of security that you need to engage with, okay, which camp do I have to address? Is it just one of them? Is it two of them? Is it all three of them? And then, of course, equally as a carrier, you need to know, well, how many different types of insurers do we have within our family? So this is what the company market ECF ecosystem looks like. Okay, and this is applicable for both the ILU and the LERMA in terms of the diagrammatic structure, but bits of functionality differ as we go through. So all versions of ECF basically work like a game of rounders or a game of softball. Happiness is achieved by sending stuff all the way round the loop. So, before I start explaining the differences, I just want to see which versions of ECF you use. So, Justin, can we have our next polling question, please? So, just so I know from our friends sitting around the table, what do you use? Do you just use the LERMA version, either as a broker or a carrier, just the ILU version, both company ones, or a mixture of company and Lloyd's? So hopefully you know the answer. Okay, let's have a look at the answers, please, Justin. That should have been long enough for people to vote. Okay, so we've got a heady mixture sitting around the table. Thank you very much for doing that. It just gives me a bit of an idea of who we've got. So, as I've said, all versions of ECF work on the basis of data going all the way around the loop, like a game of rounders or a game of softball. Everything starts with the broker in the top left-hand corner. Now, that could be what I would call a broker. So, you know, an Aon, a McGill, a Lockton's, whoever, are experts collecting their own fees. We've got some of you sitting around the table. So you're wearing that hat as well. If there were any of the fee collectors, so the uniques of this world, they would be wearing that hat. Whoever is wearing that hat has to do two things. Firstly, they need to put data in the correct room in the class database. And secondly, they need to put documents into the filing cabinet. So if you look at the bottom left hand of this diagram, you will see 4 squares, each with class in them. And that's a diagrammatic explanation of the class database. It is a heavily segmented database. And I think of it like a house with 4 rooms. Each room has a door to the outside through which data can come in and data can flow out. But the walls are pretty impenetrable. So what that means is whoever's wearing our broker hat has to look at their security and say, right, okay, I've got some LERMA companies, I've got some ILU companies, and of course they might also say, right, well, I've actually got some Lloyd's syndicates as well. But focusing on the company side. So if they've got ILU and LERMA companies, basically they've got to put the data into 2 separate rooms in the class database. Now, I mean, there are copying functions, which don't mean they don't have to completely retype everything, but that is the discipline. That hard data needs to go into 2 different rooms in the database, and there's slightly different data requirements as well, depending on which market we're talking to. Documents need to be attached, and then the transaction is released. Now, one of the key pieces of data that the broker will have entered into either the ILU room in the house or the LERMA room in the house is who is the bureau leader. And we'll talk in a moment about making sure you know which family any particular carrier lives in. And each carrier will have asked Velenetic, who of course control all of these ecosystems, about how often they want their to-do lists refreshed. Now, for our carriers sitting around the table, some of you might use write-back systems like Trax or DocoSoft or Guidewire, that type of thing. Some of you may just go into ECF itself, and so you would be reliant on the claims awaiting actions list. Doesn't really matter what you use, but the claims workflow triggers sort of electronic nudge, driven also by who the broker says is the bureau leader, will prompt that transaction appearing in the leader's to-do list. Now, the first thing I always say to insurers is just because it appears in your to-do list doesn't mean necessarily that you are the leader. 99% of the time, the broker has made the right choice, but it's always a good idea just to double check. So this is where the business rules diverge. Because if you are a LERMA carrier, you have to take certain steps at this point that if you are an ILU leader, you don't. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. But the key thing is that within ECF, all of the people, all of the carriers that have to be involved in decision making, and that again differs between the ILU and the LERMA versions of ECF, they will respond. So the key thing at this point is so what? Well, the so what is actually quite powerful, and again, quite a fundamental difference between the company versions of ECF and the Lloyd's version of ECF. In the company market version of ECF, the responses made by the carriers, so comments, radio button, they have an impact, i.e., they will prompt data flowing to other carriers. They will prompt the movement of the banking cogs if the broker has asked for money. And you might say, well, so what? Well, the so what is on the Lloyd's side, the absolute reverse is true. On the Lloyd's version of ECF, the responses by the leaders in ECF, so our public comments, our radio buttons, have absolutely no impact at all. The only impact is that the broker knows what the leader has said. In terms of anybody else in the Lloyd's market knowing what's going on, any movement of the banking cogs, no. On the Lloyd's side, it's absolutely necessary for that transaction to go through the Velenetic or exchanging claims teams for those additional processes to happen. Okay? So let's move on. How do you know who you are? Well, hopefully, if you're a carrier, you do know who you are. But make sure everybody understands how to quickly and easily identify the difference. You can see in this underwriting stamp, and welcome if we have any Aspen colleagues sitting around the table, you can see there, firstly, it has the letters XIS in there. And then you can see a 7-number code. Now, the XIS bit in there is telling you that this is an Aspen stamp that is put down in their capacity as a bureau company. And the 7-number code tells us that they are an ILU company. Now, it's really important to understand that those old distinctions still exist. And what I mean by that is that you could have a company set up today that will be either set up as an ILU company or as a Lerma company. And generally speaking, the decision will be prompted by what is the expectation of the majority of the business? Is it going to be more Marini? Is it going to be more non-Marini? In terms of the different versions of ECF, when the Lloyd's version was built, which, I mean, the Lloyd's version went live in 2007, so about 20 years after the company ones, it was based on the ILU one. So if you work across those two platforms, you will see some commonality. In contrast, this underwriting stamp is from a Lerma company. So again, you can see the XIS, and that tells you it's a bureau stamp. And you see a very different code, a letter and 4 numbers. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing the bureau company is that for many companies operating in London, they can and do, driven by their own needs and wants, have the ability to write business on a non-bureau basis. And what's therefore really important is if you are wearing the broker hat and you're looking at a list of security and you can see a list of companies, is to look very, very carefully, because it might be a company that you do engage with and have engaged with historically on a bureau basis, so an underwriting stamp like this. But for this particular risk that you're trying to collect a fee on or trying to collect a claim on, they are actually or have put down a non-bureau line. And the way that you would identify that is that there would be no XIS and there would be no 7-digit or letter and 4-digit code in their underwriting stamp. That's what would tell you. And of course, we must always remember that many, many organizations in London now are multi-platform. And it's not just as simple as they might have a Lloyd's syndicate, which of course you would identify with the anchor in the underwriting stamp, but also they can have multiple companies. And certainly, I think from memory, Aspen have multiple companies. So they might be 2 ILU companies. It might be an ILU company and a Lerma company. So just if you're wearing the broker hat particularly, just look very, very carefully at who the underwriting security is. So in all markets, company and Lloyd's, there is the concept of a leader. Now, if we start with the Lerma market first, there is no fundamental concept in the Lerma market of the leader being able to make claims decisions on behalf of the followers. It is possible, it's not the baseline kind of rule of thumb, but it is possible if there is very specific language written into the contract to give them that authority. But generally speaking, no, it's every carrier makes their own decisions. In the ILU market, there is delegation of decision making to the leaders, and that's what makes it very similar to the Lloyd's market. But in all markets, one of the fundamental roles of the leader is that of being a data guardian, and also the necessity to complete some mandatory fields. The last distinction is within Lerma. When a broker releases a transaction in the Lerma version of ECF, it goes to the Lerma leader, or the organization that the broker has put into the class database as the Lerma leader. And it is their role at that point, the leader, to decide whether that transaction can be released to all the other Lerma market. And that's the process of circulation. It's important to understand if you are a Lerma leader, that transaction is with you only until you let it out, as it were. And I want to talk about that a little bit more, okay? Something else that's important to be aware of, and this is a screenshot from ECF itself rather than one of the write-back systems, is that there are a number of useful hyperlinks. So, for example, the send link hyperlink, which I don't think is actually on any of the write-back systems. Very simply, you click it, it opens up your email system, and in the body of the email, it puts a hyperlink to the claim and the transaction. So you can send it to whomever you need to send it to. And if you don't have an internal claims management system, you could just use it internally if you needed to refer a claim to somebody more senior in your own organization. And as long as the recipient of the email has authority to go into ECF and into that claim, just click on the hyperlink, nice and easy. The document file viewer is an interesting piece of functionality in that the idea is great, actually. The idea is that instead of having to look at all the documents loaded in by the broker individually, that the technology, it's a piece of Adobe technology, will stitch them all together, and then carriers can create themselves a claims book, they can create a risk documents book, and it's much easier just to flick through. As I said, it's great in theory. In practice, it doesn't really work very well if you have things like bordereau. Because it acts a bit like a print preview function, effectively you get the top left-hand corner of the bordereau, and a bordereau spread over about 85 pages. And so that's where another one of those hyperlinks comes in quite useful, particularly if, as a carrier, you don't use a write-back system, which of course sucks the documents in for you. If you're not using one of those and you want to look at, for example, a bordereau in its native form, then click the IMR hyperlink. And that effectively takes you behind the scenes, because the version of ECF we use today is called ECF2. So it doesn't take a genius to work out there was probably ECF1. And in the older version of ECF, you could see the documents that the broker had loaded in their native form. You can't in ECF2 without using that particular hyperlink. Cross-market comments is the only part of the functionality where some information can get through the walls in the house. Because as long as the broker has used the same UCR for any combination of markets, so ILU, Lerma, Lloyd's, then the public comments made by the decision-making agreement parties in all of those markets will be visible to each other. The carriers can also enter private comments, which are never visible to the broker. And in the company market, they are quite narrowly visible, quite often actually just to the carrier that entered them. But certainly if I'm looking at a claim file that either I haven't seen myself for a while, or I'm looking at a claim file I haven't seen before, I always go to cross-market comments because, well, as long as the comments are coherent, gives me an idea of where we are, okay, or what the status is, where we're hopefully driving forward to. Now, view UMR takes us effectively upstairs into the risk section of the ECF platform. And that allows us to look at risk documents in their native form, also allows us to check signings if we think that actually maybe the presentation has been made on the wrong section of the policy. Now, view market response allows me, if I'm going into a claim as a carrier, to then see, okay, I might have agreed it as a leader. Let's say I'm a Lerma leader. Has everybody else responded to it yet? And of course, this is something that the brokers are going to be paying fairly close attention to. They want to know whether everybody that they're waiting a response from has actually responded. But it might be that as a leader, you might get a call to say, right, you haven't responded to something. Or it might be as a learner follower, you might get a call to say you haven't responded to something. And one way of somebody just checking to see what's going on, look at view market response, and it will show all of the responding parties and has it been not acknowledged, so NAK, has it been queried, so that's INFed on the Lerma side or pended on the ILU side. And then view UCR transactions as a carrier is a great way of moving around within the file. And particularly if you've got a big file and you don't have a write back system as a carrier and you want to look at some documents from earlier in the file, it's much better to actually move backwards through the file to go to an earlier UCR and then ask the document file viewer to present the documents to you. If you've got a big file and you ask the DFV to give you the whole claims file, you'll still be waiting a week next Wednesday. So this is the carrier's view, and it's important to understand that the carriers are actually logging into the IMR. And that sits effectively as a nice, or supposedly nice, user interface. You're still actually looking at the class database, but in a slightly kind of prettier version. All carriers should be able to log straight into the class database, but that's generally reserved for some administration functions in the background. And so on the left-hand side of this screen, what we've got, and there's a number of different tabs, is all data that the broker has put in, okay? And then on the right-hand side, there are some financial bits, and then what we've got is the bit that I'm going to blow up in a minute, which is the actions, the responses. So on the ILU side, which is a far simpler version of ECF than the Lerma one, you've got the business class. Now, be aware that you have to choose a business class. But going back to what I was saying about companies will be set up as ILU companies or Lerma companies, you could have a company that has been set up as an ILU company because when it was first set up, its expected business was going to be more marine and aviation. But just because it's an ILU company doesn't mean that it cannot write non-marine business, and a number of them do. But it then causes a problem, let's call it a problem, when the claims come in, because the choices behind that business class drop down are kind of marine and aviation-y type choices. The table, certainly, as far as I'm aware, has not been updated dramatically in the last few years. And so it might be that you've just got to find the nearest option that suits what you've got. Okay. Now, some of you might do, for example, excess of loss reinsurance, where there will be simultaneous payment of reinstatement premiums. And this button exists, and functionality exists on the Lerma side as well. And so what's really important is that the business expectation is that the money will move in both directions simultaneously. And so what you need to do is when you are agreeing the claim, the broker will have also loaded the additional premium documentation as well for you to review. And under the business rules, your agreement to the claim is taken to be your agreement to the additional premium as well. But what you need to do is change that radio button from no to yes. What does that do? Well, basically, it puts a lock on the banking cogs. Because remember what I said earlier about your actions as a carrier in either of the company market versions of ECF have impact. And if the brokers asked for money or expert collecting their own fees asked for money, then you're saying yes, and we'll talk about what that means in practical terms in a minute, starts the banking cogs whirring. But you don't want that claims money to move until a human at Valenetic has processed the additional premium so that they move simultaneously. And so by moving that sim rip to yes, it locks the claims payment. The additional premium payment will be processed by a Valenetic technician. And once they've processed it and released the premiums transaction, they will unlock the claims transaction. So it will move simultaneously. Now, this is a screenshot from a completed transaction. But for example, with the cedant in liquidation, if that was actually set to yes, it would prompt a requirement for information to go round to all the carriers, and the same is also true on the Lerma side. The chase up intervals, again, same on the Lerma side, it helps you manage your static processes. And then on the ILU side, whether it's an advice or a settlement, the carrier has two options. We authorize it or we pend it. Now, the pend is effectively their query function, okay? But the important thing to remember on the ILU side is that when the broker releases the transaction, it will go to the ILU leader as identified by the broker, and that may well be the only carrier on the ILU market that will respond, okay? And that is subject to the business rules. If it's advices, it'll only be a leader that responds. If it's a request for money, a settlement, it'll be a leader or potentially 1, 2. And again, if you're not quite sure what the criteria would be, go and have a look at the claims guidelines. So let's now focus on Lerma. Again, different platform, different functionality, different business rules about, for example, who has to respond. So let me go back to that concept of circulation. I cannot overemphasize the importance of Lerma leaders recognizing what the impacts are of circulating a transaction without really looking at it first. Because when the broker submits it to you, as I've said, one of your roles as a leader is to say, is this fit for purpose, basically? It's not necessarily going to be complete, certainly at FNOL. And the harsh reality is that in all of the versions of class, so ILU, Lerma, and Lloyd's, very few fields are mandatory. Those of you who are brokers know that. So some brokers will put in more information than the technology demands. Some won't, quite frankly. But what you're looking for as a leader is there anything here which is wrong, basically? Is the signing wrong? Is the date of loss wrong? Now, at this point, if there is something wrong, what you can do as a leader is make contact with the broker. Hopefully, they've put good contact details on the transaction. Get them to change the data. Let's say it's, change the signing, change the date of loss, whatever it might be. And they can then just re-release the transaction. So you don't need to touch any response buttons. It's just a phone call, an email, whatever. But if you can't get hold of them, then if you're not happy to let that data out into the public domain, as it were, then your option will be to reject the transaction. Now, in that case, again, the broker can go back into the transaction, they can correct any data that needs correcting, and then release it back out again. The key thing is once you circulate, and I call that opening the gate. So you're opening the gate to let that data out. into your own systems and into everybody else's systems. Once you do that, that data is locked. And so if somebody else spots that there's something wrong in that data, the broker cannot go back into that transaction and just correct that data. The resolution of that problem is going to be something different, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's our circulation screen on the Lerma side. So again, you can see there a number of business classes, claim category, subcategory, they're all mandatory. And the same point I made about an ILU company writing non-marine business is arguably also true, that you could have a Lerma company writing marine business as well. So, good question that's come up in the Q&A. Let's deal with that now. So, presumably from a carrier. When I reject a sequence, why does it remain in my workflow? How do I know if the broker has received my rejection? Okay, well, in the first instance, you're not going to get any particular notification sort of pop up in front of you on ECF that the broker has received the rejection, but well, as long as ECF doesn't fall over somewhere in the middle, you're using that radio button and clicking submit should almost immediately reflect in when the broker's looking at the class database for that particular transaction, which hopefully they will be doing, monitoring the transactions they've released into the insurance market. They will see that that rejection has happened, and of course hopefully you've put some good comments in there to explain why. Now it will remain in your workflow until the broker refreshes that transaction and re-releases it. And in some ways, I suppose it acts as quite a good aid memoir to you as a carrier to watch for the broker refreshing and re-releasing things, because obviously what you want to do is just have those transactions moving around the ecosystem properly. Because of course, as a leader, if you reject a transaction or reject a sequence, then everybody else in the Lerma market is blind. They don't know what's going on at this point, certainly in terms of information being provided to them via ECF or via any messaging. So hope that helps. So we've got our mandatory fields. Same point I made earlier about the simultaneous reinstatement. Now, all underwriters to see the file. Well, you can see there it's defaulted to no. Now, remember that although you're using a slightly prettier screen as carriers, you're looking at the databases that were created 40 odd years ago. And so there are a number of radio buttons, a number of responses actually, that we'll talk about in a minute, that are now out of date effectively. And the all underwriters to see file is a classic example, because all underwriters can see the file because it is in the IMR. Now, minor precautionary is a radio button which basically, if you changed it as a leader to yes, as long as the incurred was nil, then all responses would be automatically set to agreed once the matter had been circulated. The chase up is exactly the same as the ILU one around the static management. So for example, in the background, so this would be a carrier would have to go into class in the background. So find somebody with the administrator rights. And you could set it up to say, right, okay, we want to pull out reports that prompt us to chase for things that haven't moved for X number of months. The default is 12, and you can incrementally step it down in 3-month chunks. Now, contractual condition applies. The default is no, and I would say it would be very, very unusual that you would ever want to change this. Okay. There is, you can see there the option for yes. So if written into the slip, there was language that said, the IUA claims guidelines will not apply, Lerma leader binds all Lerma carriers, then that's where you could change it to yes. And what that would mean would be that your response as a leader would be automatically replicated for all other Lerma carriers. I don't think I've ever seen that in a slip. Some of you might have done, but I don't think I ever have. And so you're probably not going to use that. The cedant in liquidation, again, as I mentioned, if that is moved to yes, it changes everybody's response to the agreement part of the transaction. This is still the circulation bit, to actually needing to see the file, but actually in reality, of course, the file is already in the filing cabinet. So I thought I saw another question pop up in the Q&A there, but it's disappeared, so we can move on. So once the leader has circulated on the Lerma side, that transaction is now available to all other Lerma carriers to intellectually respond to, as I would say. And of course, the leader must also remember that they have to go and intellectually respond to it as well. Now, because you are using, as I said, 40-year-old technology, even though you're looking at it through a slightly more modern lens, there are some responses, some response buttons that are available to you, both for advices and for settlements, that are really out of date. You shouldn't be using them now. But one of the very important things, particularly if the broker or expert asking for the fees to be paid, if they're asking for money, is there's actually two different ways of saying, yes, we will pay you money. And that is very impactful on the speed with which the money will move. And then last but not least, we need to talk about queries, because again, the functionality between the ILU, the Lerma and the Lloyd's versions of ECF is different. And I see this causing some serious problems around the market. Right, we've had another little question pop up there. Let's have a quick look at that. Oh, be patient, my friend. I will be answering that question in a moment. So this is the response screen on the Lerma side for an advice. Okay. So I just want to really focus on the radio buttons at the bottom. So you can see there the ability to declare a conflict. I'm going to come back to immediate part collection in a moment, because that's relevant, of course, only to settlements. Now, with the no further response particularly, you could move that to yes. And what that will do is basically set it up that as long as the incurred doesn't move from where it is at the moment, future transactions will effectively zoop straight past without you having to formally respond to them. But I would strongly recommend that any Lerma carriers sitting around the table just check what their own kind of company appetite is for that. You'll see the responses at the bottom. Remember, this is an advice screen. CAA, claim, advice, agreed. DIS, which is basically dispute. INF, we want more information, which is the query. And FIL, which in the old days, before we had the IMR, was the carrier saying to the broker, please wander around to our office with the paper claim file. So, of course, that is a classic example of a response you don't need anymore, because the FIL should be in the IMR. Now, if this was a settlement transaction, you would have different responses available to you as a carrier. Yes, I'm happy to pay money. No, I am not happy to pay money. ACC, which is, I am theoretically happy to pay money, but the person you're asking me to pay money to also owes me money. So there's not going to be any settlement generated, no actual movement of money. We're going to go and kind of sort it out in the background and do a bit of a net set off. And then we've got our INF and our FIL. So, and this will answer the Q&A that's just popped up. How does money movement move? How does it work on the Lerma side? So the basic response is yes. So if you've got 5 Lerma carriers, then if Lerma carrier 1, the leader, says yes, and number 2 says yes, and number 3 says yes, and number 4 says yes, and number 5 says yes, then let's say those are all done within, say, 4 days, then the signing, so the starting of the banking cogs moving, will happen on the evening of the last response. Okay, so if you're a broker or an expert looking to collect their own fees, you're watching for those responses to come through, and you know that the cogs will start to move on the last day of the responses. Now, if one of those 5 says no, then it blocks everything. I mean, seriously blocks everything. So if you've got 4 carriers that have said yes and 1 that says no on the Lerma side, nobody's money moves. Now, this is where the ability as a carrier to divorce your payment from anybody else's is really important. Because if you remember back to that screenshot a minute ago, there was a radio button that said immediate part collection. So if as a carrier, you go yes, and then you move that radio button from no to yes, then the response, the coded response that the broker gets back is CES. And that tells them that you have dislocated your payment from anybody else's, and that a signing for your bit of the payment will move, or that signing will be created on the evening of the day that that carrier responds. And then the last version is if you've got 5 carriers, 2 say yes, and 3 just haven't quite got round to it yet. They haven't said no, they just haven't said anything at all. Then for those 2 carriers that have said yes, on the evening of the 5th day after circulation, a signing will be generated for that part payment. So,
Charlotte, just had a question. Can you comment on the CES response type?
so that's what I'm just doing.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I saw the question and then so we've been moving on to it. So I want to talk more about CES, both from the perspective as a carrier and a broker. So as a broker, particularly, if you're monitoring those responses and you can see that Lerma Carrier 1 has said yes, Lerma Carrier 2 has said yes, Lerma Carrier 3 has said no, you know that that response from Lerma Carrier 3 will block the payments from 1 and 2. So you need to be getting in contact with 1 and 2 immediately to try and persuade them to change their response from yes to yes plus immediate partial collection, i.e. CES, because that will then dislocate their payment from anybody else's. Okay, so somebody saying no will not have any impact. As a carrier, think about using yes plus immediate partial, i.e. CES, as a way of standing out positively to your broker community, but also just be mindful, particularly if you're a follower and the leader hasn't yet responded, not to necessarily jump the gun, maybe wait and see what the leader does, just in case you agree a payment and in fact the leader themselves says no. So just be aware of the functionality, but particularly as a carrier, just be clear on your own internal rules of how to use that. So, okay. On the ILU side, remember I said that in terms of money movement, it'll either be the leader or sometimes the leader plus the second. Well, the signing will be created on the evening of the last response. So if it's just the leader, the evening that they respond. If it's a leader plus second, evening of the second's response. And then in terms of how quickly the money will appear in our broker or our experts' bank accounts, the company market works generally to 3-day settlements. So if there's a signing created tonight, so tonight being a Wednesday, then the money should appear in the broker's accounts on Monday. So let's talk a little bit about querying. The functionality is very, very different, unhelpfully. So on the Lerma side, our carriers will use the INF option. And remember that once the transaction has been circulated, if the INF is around inaccuracies in the data that the brokers put into the class database, at that point, the data is locked. And so there's only two resolutions for that problem. One is actually you can quite legitimately delete the transaction and just set up a new one. Or you can just load a new transaction on top. Because one of the key things on the Lerma version of ECF is that an INFed transaction doesn't block the pipe. And this is absolutely fundamentally different to the Lloyd's and the ILU versions of ECF. Because in both of those, if on the ILU side it's pended or on the Lloyd's side it's queried, that transaction blocks the pipe. And so that transaction itself must be resolved either by deletion, which again is perfectly legitimate, or by going into the transaction and correcting the data. Because on the Lloyd's and the ILU side, if a transaction has been queried, then the broker can still go in and refresh the data and re-release. Huge difference in functionality. The key thing to remember is even if a transaction is deleted, the carrier's comments on that transaction will still be visible in that cross-market comments section that I talked about earlier. So this is a real plea to brokers, is that when you do see a queried transaction in any of the three platforms, just be clear in your mind, okay, which version of ECF am I dealing with here? What are the acceptable resolution strategies? Because I do see on the Lloyd's side and the ILU side where there have been queried transactions where the broker's just loaded in a new one on top. And I suspect it is because there is perhaps a lack of understanding that the functionality is different. Loading a new one on top is fine on the Lerma side, not on the ILU or the Lloyd's side. The last point, particularly on the Lerma side, and this is for the carriers, is you've infed a transaction. Let's say that the reserve is wrong. And the broker's loaded in a new transaction with the correct reserve. What you might do is just respond to the latest transaction and leave the infed one sort of flapping in the breeze, as it were. Now, the technology will allow you to do that, but the business rules, best practice, are that you shouldn't do that. You should go in and update the inf response now to a positive response, which would be CAA. But what's really important is the order in which you do that, because we're talking about data flowing as a result of you responding to transactions. And the key thing is that the data flows in the order in which you respond to them, not the order in which the broker presents them. And so if you go in and respond to the latest one and go, all right, that's good, that reserve's right now, la la da da da, right, let me go and just tidy up the other one, then because you're doing that action second, as it were, that's the data that will then flow into your system. And so you'll still be left with the out-of-date reserve. So go in and look at the new one. Go, all right, I'm happy with that. That's good. Go in, resolve the infed one, then go in and formally respond to the new one. And then the data, the latest data you have in your system is the nice, clean, shiny, correct stuff. Right, I can see a new question pop up. Right, so question, can you give more insight on Lerma class cancellation? No, I'm not sure I can, because I'm not sure I understand the question. So if our questioner could just pop a little bit more detail into there, I will come back to that and hopefully I will be able to answer it. So whilst we're waiting for a little bit more on that one, I just want to talk about SCAP. So as I said at the beginning, there's a very detailed SCAP session run by the IUA in a couple of weeks' time. So just look on the IUA events page for that. But let's just talk about it in outline. The concept is very simply this, that there are certain claims that are small in value, not particularly complicated in their facts or circumstances, and there doesn't need to be more than one pair of eyes on it. And so that is the basis of the single claims agreement party clause, which is in most slips, unless on the carrier side your underwriters have refused to allow it in there, which some of them do. And so one of the challenges with SCAP is that theory is great, but it's not supported by the technology because we've got three versions of ECF that don't really talk to each other. And so what's fundamental is that every stakeholder in the process understands what they should be doing and, more importantly, perhaps what they shouldn't be doing. And so the way the process starts is that the broker will have a claim and they will look at that claim and they will go, do we think this is a claim that falls within the eligibility criteria to be presented to the market as a SCAP claim? And basically, is the net value to the SCAP insurers less than 250,000 sterling? And, are the facts simple? And if the broker thinks, yeah, actually, I think this is eligible to be agreed as a SCAP claim, then when they load it into ECF, they have to put as the starting characters of the loss name SCAP to tell everybody that they think it's SCAP, and then 1 or 2 letter code which identifies to everybody where the intellectual decision maker is, where the SCAP leader is. And so you need to know your codes. L for Lerma, I for ILU, S for syndicate or Lloyd's, and N for non-bureau, i.e. the intellectual decision maker does not use ECF. Now you'll notice there that I've said that non-bureau includes LIC, so Lloyd's Europe, basically. Now, the key thing is, remember that is non-bureau because LIC is an insurance company, but it doesn't use the company version of ECF. So, broker identifies, right, I think the intellectual decision maker is in the Lerma market. Remember what I said about 3 versions of ECF that don't talk to each other? Well, what the broker has to do, if they have, for example, on their security, Lerma, ILU, and Lloyd's, they have to send it into all 3 versions of ECF. Okay? But really, really clearly labeling it, because the next really important part of the process is if you, as a carrier, are looking at a claim in your workflow, your to-do list, just because it's in that to-do list doesn't necessarily mean you need to actually deal with it. And that is about the most counterintuitive thing I could possibly say to you. But it's true. Because in our example, where we've said the intellectual decision maker is in the Lerma market, if there's a Lloyd's market, then it will appear in the Lloyd's leads to-do list. And if there's an ILU market, it will appear in the ILU leads to-do list. And if you are either of those, you need to be able to see it in your workflow and see that it says SCAP L for Lerma. Know what hat you're wearing. Am I wearing a syndicate hat? Am I wearing an ILU company hat? And go, all right, I can hear Charlotte in the back of my head, leave it alone. Because if the process works properly, then once our Lerma leader has dealt with it, then it will be picked up by Velinetic, and in a combination of robots and humans, they will do the responses for the Lloyd's market and the ILU market, and I promise you, it will disappear from your to-do lists. Now, if it doesn't disappear from your to-do lists, then the process has broken. Something's gone wrong. And one of the things I see going wrong too much is if I go into ECF, where I can actually see the transactions for all 3 markets, It might be coded, for example, for the ILU market and the Lloyd's market as SCAP L, but there's no transaction for the Lerma market. So they're not going to respond. And so the Velonetic robots won't deal with it. But if you want to know more about SCAP, come along to the SCAP session in a couple of weeks' time. Okay. And then we will go into it in huge detail. So let me have a look at our Q&A page again. Right. So Lerma underwriter gets a copy of option of lead rejection. Can this not be used instead of querying and circulating? So the rejection is the option for the leader as opposed to circulation. At that point, the leader only has two choices. Are they happy to let the transaction go to the rest of the Lerma market, and that's to circulate it, and that locks the data, or they reject it? So absolutely, if you are a Lerma leader, you should always consider whether you are happy for that data to be released to the followers. Don't just circulate automatically. And then another query around SCAP, which I think I've actually already answered. Financially, it has to have a net value to the underwriters who have agreed to be part of the SCAP community of less than 250,000 GBP. Now, it might be, for example, that there's a huge tower of coverage, that a claim just pops into the top layer of coverage, all the underlying layers are burnt, but it still could be legitimately a SCAP claim for that very top layer of coverage. So, a question about the FIL response. Absolutely, it's outdated because the FIL response, when the Lerma version of a class was first created, was literally you asking the broker, please come and visit me with the paper claim file. If, of course, you want to talk to the broker, then ideally that should be either, picking the phone up to them, emailing them and say, can you pop round for a chat? I want to talk about this more. But all of the documentation that should have been in the traditional paper claim file should now be in the IMR for your ready access. So another question is, we understand that a Lerma lead underwriter has the ability to set a class status to cancelled. Right. I am not particularly familiar with that functionality. So what I will do is, you've set yourself up as anonymous. If you would be so kind as to actually email that query to Pria at the IUA, I will take that offline and get a response to you directly. Right, another question. Okay, so a really good question about what is effectively functionality change. So the question, so everybody's aware, will there be any possibility in the near future to have the same option like lead rejection to follow markets as well? Because when follow Lerma queries, then brokers only have one option, either to email or re-release. So one of the places we find ourselves, of course, right now is that whilst there was a hope that these three very old versions of ECF were going to be merged into a single cloud-based platform, that's now not going to happen, certainly in the immediate future. So what I don't know is to what extent there is now going to be any appetite, because we are back to using these three old versions of ECF, any appetite for functionality upgrades going forward. I suspect it's under discussion, because I think what had happened over the last few years is various ideas and requests for functionality upgrades had been rather pushed to one side pending the arrival of the new ICOS. And so my probably unhelpful answer to that question about changing to functionality in relation to how a follower can kick something back is hopefully, but not sure and don't know to what timeline. But depending on which part of the market the person who's answered that question lives in, I would strongly recommend that you talk to your trade body. For example, if you happen to be an insurer, talk to the IUA and get your voice heard in terms of those requests for functionality changes. Now I can see something popping up in chat as well. Okay, so just a little prompt for proper use of the functionality from our host. So let me see. So we've dealt with that. We've dealt with that. Right, so whilst I'm tidying up my homework, so hopefully we'll get that query coming about the class status to cancel, but I will go away and research that. Any other questions coming in from anybody? Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. As we said at the beginning, the session has been recorded, and so all attendees will get a link to the recording, a copy of the materials, a copy of the IUA claims guidelines, and as I've said, check out the IUA events page just to get the information about when the SCAP session is as well. Thank you very much for your questions. Hopefully that helps everybody. And do you know what? If you're walking out of this session going, I haven't learned anything new, you've got no excuse for getting anything wrong then, and you still get your CPD points. So thank you for joining us. Over to you, Priya, just to close.
Cheers. Thank you for everyone who joined today's sessions. Again, another big thank you to Charlotte for her wealthy knowledge on claims in the market, and we hope to see you all at the next session. Again, if there are any questions or anything you'd like to follow up on, then please drop myself or Deb an email. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.